In addition to it highlighting the people of early Philadelphia, so basically Philadelphia from the colonial period up to about the Civil War is the time frame for this book. Um, uh, Dallett's book really highlights the places of Philadelphia, and so this book would be a wonderful companion if you were going to, spend a couple days doing some visits within the city. If you have some relatives coming in who want to explore, a number of the the people and the places highlighted in this book are a little bit off the beaten path. Some of them were famous during their own day, but forgotten to us today. And some of them really are a little bit more obscure figures who Dallet's really just bringing to light for the first time. But for each of these figures, there are places that survive that one could go and visit. And those historic sites really do help enrich one's appreciation of these stories. And in many of these chapters, the places themselves come across as yet another character. And so that dialogue between the stories and the places, is an enriching one. So my partner in this was Daniel Richter. Daniel Richter is a professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania and head of the McNeil Center for Early American Studies. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. I am a professor of history at John Carroll University, which is in University Heights in Ohio, which is right next door to Cleveland. But I have Eastern PA roots. I grew up in the Lehigh Valley, and then I was a student of Dallet at Ursinus College, and then went on to get a PhD at Temple University. And while at Temple, I was also a regular participant in the McNeil Center for Early American Studies consortium, which is based in Penn, and was a fellow there and had an office there for a few years. And so let me talk just a little bit more about Dallet herself. So Dallet grew up in Philadelphia. She went on to Princeton for her undergraduate degree, and then she went on to Brandeis for her PhD. She studied under a famous historian, John Demos, who was a historian is a historian of the family and many other things. And actually, Dallet took her inspiration from Demos and became a historian of the early American family. And she in turn inspired me. And my first book was about the history of youth in early America, which came out with Penn Press. But as Dallet's career evolved, she more and more wanted to reach a broader audience, and I would say that this book was the culmination of that vision. This book really is written for a general audience. Anyone could pick this book up and follow along. It's well told, and it's written in such a way that there isn't scholarly jargon that gets in the way. It really is sort of a biographical approach, and yet it still evokes the lives of these people in a way that's consistent with recent scholarship. And particularly, Dallet does a really nice job of sort of balancing, showing some of the opportunities that were available, but also some of the limitations that these people ran up against, particularly some of the figures who were women and an African-American man, Francis Johnson, who I'll talk about. And so it's sort of indebted to all the good work that social historians have done over the last number of decades, but it also sort of invites you into the parlors and the bedrooms of these individuals in a way that's truly engaging. But Dallet, when she passed away, it was a recurrence of cancer, and the recurrence came pretty suddenly. She thought she was clear, and when the recurrence happened, I saw her not long before she passed, and she told me that every day she was writing while walking on her treadmill, that was the way she was going to crank this out and see this to completion. She didn't quite get there, But she left a pretty complete manuscript. We had to tidy up the footnotes and break down some of the longer quotes into more bite-sized pieces, and the section introductions weren't done. We had to sort of do work on sort of making decisions about the images we used. But it's a mark of the impact that Dalit had on the larger scholarly community that when we sent out a call to call on individuals to help finish up our chapters, they rose to the task. So this is a list of the 12 individuals who helped with bringing this book to completion. And it really represents a cross section of the historical community in the Philadelphia region. So the McNeil Center for Early American Studies, basically every couple of weeks, historians from the Philadelphia region, and by Philadelphia region, really I'm talking about almost like a 100-mile radius around the city, come to talk about their works together. They'll share chapters they're writing or articles they're writing and get feedback from the wider community. And Dalit was a central figure in that community, just so supportive of her fellow scholars, always had supportive and keen questions to ask. And so this list of historians that you see here represent a cross section of that community. And literally within 24 hours, when we asked for people's help, they all immediately stepped up and offered to shepherd through one, an individual chapter to completion. So some of these are younger scholars. A couple of these people are former students of Dalit, myself included. And some of them are very established senior scholars like Gene Sutherland, who's a professor emeritus at Lehigh and the very top scholar on Quaker history. And so, I won't go into the details of each of these individuals, but simply want to sort of highlight the sort of element of community in bringing this book to completion, which is so apropos because the book itself is very much about community, because while it's 12 individual biographies, there's so many cameos where figures from one chapter show up in another. And so one could read this book in different ways. You could choose a couple chapters of figures that fascinate you, that you are interested in, or it does really hang together as a complete whole because of that integration, that the fact that these lives were so intersecting, and plus the change over time element. We see how Philadelphia evolves from a smaller colonial city of 10 to 12,000 to, in the years before the Civil War, when it was over 500,000 people. And so Philadelphia had evolved quite a good deal over the course of the span of time that this book covers. So the book begins with three religious figures, men of faith, as she calls them. And what's interesting about their lives, what comes through in this particular section, is that there was a real blending of the sacred and secular in Penn's pluralistic colony. So William Penn, of course, really is the first American figure. Well, perhaps Roger Williams gets some claim on this as well. But the first colony for sure that's really established with the ideal of religious freedom. People often get confused and think that the Puritans were seeking religious freedom. If they were, it was in the most narrow of senses, that they didn't want to be persecuted. But they had a keen idea of what orthodoxy was, and they prosecuted people for heresy. Most famously perhaps with the Salem witch trials. But they also hung Quakers on Boston Square for preaching faith at odds with their own. So really, it's with William Penn in Pennsylvania that you get a colony that's established on the principle of pluralism. But because different faith expressions were allowed, doesn't mean that faith didn't have a place in the public square. And with these three figures, really, they bring their faith and their values into the public square, and it very much influences their vision for society and for the reform of society. The first of these three figures is Anthony Benezet, or sometimes pronounced Benezet, the French pronunciation being former, of course, anglicized perhaps as Benezet. But in any case, um, Benezet was a Philadelphia Quaker and reformer, as they say here. Uh, he lived in the early to late 18th century. Um, and, as you can see, when his house was first built, that's Chestnut Street downtown. It gives you a sense of the environs of Philadelphia at the time. It was still Penn's sort of green country town. Um, and what you'll see portrayed of him is his commitment to education and to reform. And so he started out running a day school for young men, but very soon thereafter branched into educating women, and then finally emphasizing the education of African Americans, because he very much believed in the sort of natural abilities and equal capacities of African Americans. And he would be one of the most central figures in pushing for the abolition of slavery, which happened in the 1780s in Philadelphia. Um, you know, he and his fellow Quakers took the lead in that fight. And of course, other northern states would follow suit, which would ultimately would yield this divide between the North and the South. Because in the colonial era, you had slavery in all of the northern colonies, and in some colonies, in places like Philadelphia and New York City, it was up to 20% of the population that was enslaved. So it was not an insignificant presence for slavery in the North. But Benezet used his belief in the equality of souls and his belief in the equal capacity of human beings to fight for the end of slavery in Pennsylvania. And so that will be his most enduring legacy. The next figure that she talks about is Henry Muhlenberg. And Muhlenberg will fight for a more ecumenical vision, one consistent with Penn. But even though Penn had fought for religious acceptance, when the Lutherans, who were German, and that was a significant fact, many of them who spoke German as they arrived, most of whom spoke German as they arrived, they weren't accepted with open arms, far from it. Benjamin Franklin, no less, fought for the exclusion of Germans from the colony and wanted to cut off German immigration. But because of the efforts of figures like Muhlenberg, they did gradually find a place in the colony. But it took hard work. He was someone who built bridges. I mean, first within the own Lutheran communion, he reached out to Swedish Lutherans who had predated him in Pennsylvania and developed strong relationships there. But then he turned to work with Presbyterians, with Anglicans, with Quakers, and really help realize Penn's vision of a place where you could have not only religious toleration, but cooperation, where these faith leaders joined reform efforts and betterment efforts for the community together. In his later years, Muhlenberg built a church and a house out in Trapp, Pennsylvania, which is, of course, close to you. And it's literally like next door to Ursinus College. The chapter editor for this particular chapter was Lisa Minardi. She was a student of Dallas, and she first began her work on the Lutheran community in Pennsylvania when she was an undergraduate at Ursinus. She wrote a senior thesis under Dowd on that. And it's a mark of Dowd's generous spirit that she learned from her student and wanted to write a chapter about one of the figures that her own student had written about. And she, drew insight from Lisa in putting together this particular chapter. The home that you see pictured there, the Muhlenberg home, is a great place to visit. I really recommend it as a site. And it's Lisa is now the historic, the director of Historic Trapp, which includes the Muhlenberg home and other buildings. They've restored the home, and they're now busy restoring the gardens of the building, and it's just a really well done site worth visiting.
Okay. Oh, we do have a question.
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
Needy, would you like to go ahead?
Hi, this is Nidhi, and I joined all of you a little late because I couldn't find the link, but just want to check. Could you see me or not?
I can't see you because of the format we're using, but I can hear you.
Okay, that's fine if you can hear me, because I couldn't see the option for the switch on the screen. You can see me. I can't see the video. So that's, if you can listen me, that's fine.
Okay. Did you have a question?
No. Thank you so much.
Okay. Sorry. All right.
Okay.
Thanks,
Okay.
Rodney. Go ahead.
So the third figure here is William White. He was a famous man in his day, but not so well known today. He's really someone that we still need a biography of, and maybe one of you will be inspired to do so. But Bill Pensack, who was a professor at Penn State University, who unfortunately also passed away a few years ago, was at work on one of White, and he maybe doesn't grab headlines the way some other historical figures do, because he was, as I say, a voice of moderation. He wasn't an arch conservative or a radical who pushed for social change. He was interested in social change, but he liked to do it from the middle, to find partners. And he led a number of reform societies. Maybe most famously, he was president of the Philadelphia Society for Improving Prisons. And his work eventually led to the establishment of Eastern State Penitentiary, which of course is a site you can visit today. The early vision for Eastern State Penitentiary, I would say, wasn't fully realized. They thought that each of the individualized cells, the solitary confinement, would provide a space of reflection where people could get in touch, in essence, with their conscience. Unfortunately, it proved actually to be something of a form of torture. And so the sort of the sad evolution of the history of prisons can be witnessed at that site. It's not consistent with White's vision, but it sort of maybe highlights the way in which optimistic ideals can some way go sideways. The other site you see pictured here is White's home, which is a site that can be visited today and is richly decorated with pieces from the time period. So if you're in the old city, it's definitely something worth visiting. Okay, so the next section of the book takes us from the colonial era into the revolutionary era, and Donald made the choice to stay away from the Benjamin Franklins of the world, the Thomas Jeffersons or George Washingtons, who of course had famous sojourns in Philadelphia during revolutionary times, and instead she focuses on the lives of three women. And in this section, it's interesting. You can see both the privilege of these women, and in general, with all of these figures, most of them have some level of privilege, and people who are lower in the social order don't really leave behind a written record, or if they do, historical societies like the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, for example, in their early years didn't deem their records worthy of preserving. And so these aren't working class women, and yet you really can see some of the difficulties that all women had to deal with. And specifically, I'll highlight here the idea of coverture, which, if you're not familiar with the term, you can take your cue from the word itself. It basically refers to the way in which women's identity was covered in marriage. We have a small remnant of that today, with women giving up their maiden name in marriage, changing their surname. But in colonial times, it was much more complete. So women typically would lose all of their property, no matter how wealthy, how much they had received from their fathers. All that property would become their husband's in marriage. Similarly, before the courts, women didn't have the right to sue or be sued. In fact, if someone assaulted a woman, her husband would sue on the grounds of property damage. And so that women were quite literally conceived of as the property of their husbands. And so as we look at these three women, we can see how that plays out, but also the way in which these women could, in fact, realize some of their potential. So Grace Groudon Galloway, I have here, she was a private warrior in political times. The warrior refers to her fight to, in essence, preserve her property, particularly for the sake of her daughter, who she was quite close to. During the American Revolution, we tend to remember the American Revolution as a fight between American patriots and the British. But the fact of the matter is, there was the Americans themselves were really equally divided between patriots and loyalists. And Grace Galloway was on the loyalist side of the ledger. Her husband fled to England, but she stayed behind and fought to preserve her Philadelphia home. And also, this is Groudon Mansion, which you can visit as well, which is outside of Philadelphia, north of Philadelphia. And she, managed to fight off some of the repo men, so to speak, one of whom was actually another figure from this book. Charles Wilson Peel, a very, probably the most famous early American painter from the Revolutionary years, actually his day job was to go into loyalist homes and oversee the repossession, or the possession, I should say, of loyalist artifacts to support the revolutionary cause. Grace Galloway managed to tuck away some things, and some of those items, those artifacts, are actually on display at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. For example, there's this gorgeous silver pitcher that she managed to hide away and preserve and pass on. And so her life was a hard one, and yet she did carve out a measure of success. She was treated as a loyalist because her husband was a loyalist. She actually wasn't given an option in terms of declaring her loyalties, but the Patriots sort of accepted the affiliation of her husband as her own. So Nancy Shippen Livingston represents another way in which women's options were limited. During the American Revolution, one of the ways in which many women's lives were in fact opening up was with respect to education and also with respect to courtship. Increasingly, women were expected to be able to choose their own marriage partners. In the colonial era, the expectation was that a lot of the negotiation and bargaining happened through parents. But that transition was a gradual one. People looked to the revolutionary ideal, the ideal of citizenship, that everyone joins into the union out of choice, and marriage increasingly was seen the same way, that you shouldn't be, in essence, born into a marriage based on your parents' preferences, but rather make that choice for yourself. But Nancy Shippen Livingston's parents weren't quite there yet. She fell in love with a French diplomat. His name was Otto, and she maintained a lifelong relationship with him. They maintained a correspondence. She never really got over her love for him. But Henry Livingston was who her parents made her marry. And he was, by all accounts, a most disagreeable fellow. Dalek actually, in one section of the book, says even Henry Livingston's mother didn't like him. So you get a sense of both Dalek's sort of wry sense of humor and also Livingston's character in that comment. And so, her tale of the three probably is the most tragic. And then the final woman is Deborah Norris Logan. And she did manage to find the love of her life in her husband, George Logan. But what's interesting about her story is, she was a dutiful wife during her lifetime and clearly took a lot from their partnership and relationship. But she really came into her own once her husband passed away, particularly with respect to her writing. She produced a memoir of her husband, which is the most valuable source today. Interestingly, however, she didn't want to see it published. And so while she got to give expression to her voice and her writing abilities, she still demurred from putting herself on the public stage. In coming decades, women will increasingly claim the mantle of authorship, although many in the early 19th century will continue to use pseudonyms. So you can see the sort of nervousness about drawing too much attention to themselves. And Deborah Norris Logan, in some ways, she reminds me a lot of Eliza from the musical Hamilton, in that, she dedicated herself to sort of preserving the memory of her husband. So with that, I'll turn to the next section. The next section takes us into the years following the American Revolution, the early American Republic. And here, the notion of the self-made man in America is maybe most fully realized. And so we have three different men who do come from difficult circumstances each and do manage to rise. There was real opportunity available as Philadelphia really did begin to rapidly expand. At the time of the American Revolution, we're looking at a city of about 30,000, as I mentioned before. By the time we get to the Civil War, it's about 500,000 people. And there's just tremendous market growth. And each of these figures managed to ride that wave, so to speak. So the first of these is Charles Wilson Gill, who I mentioned before. And I should actually go back real quickly to Deborah Norris Logan. This is one of Peele's portraits as well, and you can see sort of this luminescent use of light and color there. And this is an even more famous painting of his. Peele's paintings are available to view all over the country at this point. He made his money on portraiture, but he had grander ambitions. He really was a showman. He was famous for these big light shows, projecting massive silhouettes in the city on occasions such as the 4th of July. He also established what was known as his American Museum, first housed in his home, later housed in the second floor of Independence Hall, and then finally having a separate structure built here, which you see here. Some of you might recognize it. That is part of the American Philosophical Society. It originally was Peele's museum. And within that museum, he showed his own paintings, but also it was sort of a natural history museum where he shared all sorts of different artifacts, including a mastodon that he personally oversaw its excavation in the Hudson Valley of New York, and put together and displayed at this museum. And so Peele is helping realize the promise of early America. The next figure here is Stephen Gerard. You might recognize the name. You might even recognize Gerard College pictured there. But Gerard is relatively forgotten. He was one of the richest Americans ever to live, estimated to be in the top 5 of the richest Americans ever to have lived, if you adjust for inflation. What's interesting about Gerard is that he really had a commitment to philanthropy. You know, he was one of the first, not only was the first wealthy Americans, he was also one of the first Americans to dedicate his money to the wider community. So a number of Philadelphia public works, such as improving the streets and whatnot, were built with a large gift he left to the city. He also left the funds to build Gerard College, which was dedicated to educating orphans in the city of Philadelphia, because he believed in the potential of young men. The final figure in this section is Joseph Hemphill. As you can take from the name, this is actually an ancestor of Dallett's. There's one other figure here that we know also was an ancestor of Dallett's, who I'll come to in a couple of minutes. Hemphill, if you know of him, it might be through this house here. This is Strawberry Mansion, which you can visit in Fairmount Park. He wasn't the original inhabitant, but the 2 wings you see on either side of the house were erected by Hemphill. He was a moderate like White in that he wanted to find compromise that would help improve his society. He was a Democratic politician. He belonged to the party of Andrew Jackson, which was dedicated to the cause of the common man, but he also took sympathy for African Americans and for particularly for indigenous Americans. He fought, even though Jackson would eventually be the author of Indian removal, Hemphill, he failed in this effort, unfortunately, but he fought strongly against Indian removal. He was more successful in helping establish as a judge the principle of judicial review, which would, his rulings as a judge would later be adopted by Chief Justice Marshall in Marbury versus Madison. And so you get to see sort of the way in which politics was negotiated in this era that was becoming increasingly divisive as we get closer to the Civil War. Fights about slavery, fights about Indian removal. The final section of the book, in some ways, is the flip side of this idea of the self-made man. We have 3 figures here who really do run headlong into some of the race and class limits of early America, limits that we are still wrestling with today. And yet they too did manage to gain success within those limits imposed. The first here is Francis Johnson. As you can see from the picture, he was an African-American musician. He was a band leader and he was a composer. He was really the first early American music celebrity. Famous globally, he was invited by the Queen of England to come and meet her and play for her. She gave him a gift of a silver bugle, which you see in this engraving of him in his right hand. And so he experiences great fame and success, and yet runs into serious limits. You know, as you read about his life, particularly through the diary of Isaac Mickle, who's another ancestor of Dallas, who she draws heavily on his writings. Mickle talks about how famous Johnson was, and he seeks out Johnson to get lessons on the violin. And so while he respects his talent, in the very next breath, he mocks him for his racial identity and uses racial slurs to talk about him. And more generally in his own life, Johnson was slighted on a regular basis. You see pictured here the musical hall, which is the building of the Musical Fund Society. Johnson was regularly invited to perform there, and yet he was denied entrance into the society itself. He was regularly reminded that as an African American, he couldn't enjoy political rights. He couldn't be accepted into elite Philadelphia society. The next figure is another one who shares, who is an ancestor of Dallas, and so she had some of her records, which is why they survived. Sarah Thorne Tyndale. She actually was quite famous in her own day, was almost entirely forgotten today. There's almost nothing written about Tyndale before this book. A mark of her obscurity today is also the fact that it proved almost an insurmountable barrier to find an image of her, but I did. It so happened that another fellow ancestor of Tyndale had written in a short online article about her and doing her own genealogical research, and she had knew another ancestor who she put me in touch with, who had managed to find a copy of a portrait that had been of Tyndale that was taped to the back of another portrait that was in her own holdings. Dowd actually managed to find the original, and when I was digging through her files, she had taken a selfie in the basement of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania with the portrait looming behind her. But when the HSP deaccessioned its holdings, we've lost track of where this portrait is. Part of that is because of COVID. It might be easier to find now. But in any case, Tyndale in her own time was a famous reformer. She was friends with Walt Whitman. She was invited to a number of the early women's rights conventions. And the reason why she had sprung to fame first was because of her wealth. Her husband actually had first established a porcelain business, and he didn't do that good a job with it, actually. It was on the verge of bankruptcy. But when he passed away, Tyndale, because of her business acumen and particularly her skill at displaying her goods in a showroom that was lit up at night in Old City, managed to make a handsome fortune just in a few short years, and then retired to a life of reform where she fought for women's rights. She fought for protecting women who were prostitutes and helping to find better opportunities for them. In the final years of her life, she spent time living in this phalanx in New Jersey, Fourierist phalanx, which was a socialist commune. And so she really reached the outer limits of reform in this era. And her story really is a fascinating one that I think you'd enjoy reading. And then the final figure here is this guy, William Derrick Kelly. And he sort of represents the limits in a slightly different way. He came from working class origins. He worked his way up the ladder. In his early years, he was a fierce advocate for working men's rights, a union organizer. He very much fought for social equality and economic equality. But as he rose within the world of politics, he gradually became an apologist for large capital companies, in particular steel companies. He came to be known as Pig Iron Kelly. And so as he climbed that social ladder, once he got to the top, he pulled that ladder up behind him. The picture you see here is West Philadelphia, where he sort of retired in his later years. At that point, West Philadelphia was a more rural location, a suburb, a streetcar suburb of Philadelphia. You see pictured here the University of Pennsylvania campus, which was really the most significant architectural imprint in West Philadelphia at the time. And so with that chapter, Dallett's book really draws to a close, and it it leaves America on the verge of civil war, a time where some of these tensions that come through in these last three chapters are most fully realized. The Civil War, of course, was about slavery, but you also can see important race and class conflicts played out in the context of the Civil War, which are sort of previewed in this section of Dallett's books. It's a very polarizing time, one sadly that is reminiscent of our own, and it represents sort of an eclipse of some of the revolutionary and early Republic ideals that come through earlier in the book. So those are the 12 figures. At this point, I want to just open it up then to questions that people might have about any of these figures or about early Philadelphia more generally.
We did have one question in the chat. Someone was wondering where the homes for Livingston and Logan were located. Do you know?
Livingston and Logan both are, I'm not going to remember the addresses off the top of my book. In Dallett's book, there is a series of maps, one for each section, and it shows the locations of each of these places that I've mentioned here. And so you can, in fact, so short answer is they're an old city. I don't remember the exact addresses off the top of my head, but within the book, it directs you with these maps to where you can find these places. And so you can do sort of a walking tour with this book in hand.
Great. And if you'd like a copy of the book, I would. The library does have a copy, but I would also encourage you to support your local bookstore. We often partner with Main Point Books in Wayne, and they've been very good to us. Any more questions? You can either raise your hand or put it in the Q&A. All right, I'm not seeing questions. This is great. This was really interesting.
Okay, I'm glad.
There's so many people that you learn more about as you go along. I'm working with someone who's doing a project on the early culinary history in Philadelphia and how influential all the African Americans were. And they were really behind a lot of the recipes and whatnot, and they haven't gotten credit. So it's been a really interesting project.
Oh yeah, that sounds very fascinating. Yeah, and the other thing I would say is, well, some of these figures would have come from relatively privileged backgrounds. The cast of characters who appear within the chapters gives a much more panoramic view of Philadelphia society. That is, they're regularly interacting and crossing paths with servants and workers and others. And so, her book really is evocative in that sense of, taking you into the streets and into the homes of average Philadelphians in this era.
Was Nancy Shippen Livingston related to Peggy Shippen?
Peggy is her, if I'm recalling correctly, Peggy is her daughter. I would have to double check on that. Right, so I'm sorry.
Nancy would be Peggy's daughter, the other way around.
Actually, I misspoke. Actually, give me 1 second here. Let me consult Dallett's book real quickly myself. Yeah, so Peggy, as I said, Peggy is her daughter.
Oh, okay.
She was born 1781. So she comes after her.
Any other questions? We have a few accolades for you here in the chat. There's no more questions. I would like to thank you so much for presenting this book, and I look forward to reading more of it. I started it, but I haven't gotten all the way through it. I would encourage everybody to check it out, and thank you so much.
No, thank you for having me.
All right. Have a great evening, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.